Hi, everybody.
Okay. Hi. Thank y'all so much for coming on tonight. This is the June meeting of the League of Women Voters for Tyler Smith County. And tonight we're talking about the important concept of redistricting. I want to thank everyone. Many of you I see out there came to the City Council meeting this morning. We'll be talking more about that later in our presentation, but I'm just kind of going to go over the basics of redistricting and talk about some current case law efforts and on the federal and state and local levels, and kind of go over some of the requirements for redistricting. I know many of you have been coming to meetings to talk about this. So if you have questions as I'm going through the presentation, please raise your hand, or if we can do them at the end, but I would love to hear from you guys if you have things that come up as questions. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. And I'm going to start the slideshow. And that will come up. Okay. There we go. Okay, perfect. So first of all, I don't know if many of you have met she did a presentation actually in March, right before COVID shut down everything down. But Stephanie Swanson is the issues chair of redistricting at the state level, and she is amazing. So a lot of these slides are thanks to Stephanie, and she is tirelessly working at the state level on redistricting and hosts basically bi-weekly meetings for any League of Women voters that are interested in the redistricting process at the state level, and has been a huge resource. So I wanted to say a special thanks to Stephanie. My name is Natalie Wright Curley. I know most of you, but I am the redistricting chair for Tyler Smith County. So redistricting is not super glamorous, but it is, in my opinion, one of the most important processes in our democracy. Redistricting basically determines the power of each individual's vote. So how does it work? Well, the redistricting is based off the census. And as you probably all mostly know, the census is done every 10 years. So it helps to track population growth and reapportion where districts need to be reapportioned for population growth. And it's basically, typically the census data is delivered to the legislatures on April 1st of census years. But because of COVID, this has been delayed, and we still don't have the breakdown of the census data, and that's not expected to be delivered until September 30th. Which is really going to constrain the timelines on how the redistricting process plays out. And we'll talk more about that later. So who is responsible for redistricting? Well, the Texas legislature does the redistricting for the states. And then, of course, the city council, the county commissioner, school boards, etc., even do have to draw districts at the local level. So maps are passed as part of regular legislation, and oftentimes there's very sophisticated software that is used by consultants or legal firms to help draw maps, which can be actually drawn in many different ways. So again, this affects the U.S. congressional districts. It affects our Texas House and state districts, and it even affects our local city council, school board, water board, and our county districts as well. So again, one of the reasons I think this has so much impact is that it only happens once every 10 years. So what we do today and how districts are drawn in this year will affect our voting rights for the next decade. So it's important. It's so important that we get it right. So there's basic redistricting principles that apply. And the first one is based from the Constitution. It's one person, one vote. And that requires that when we get census data, districts need to be redrawn to be of equal size. In the congressional districts at the US level, there's actually 0 deviation is the goal for the amount of people that can be per district. That is there's a little more leeway. The state level is a 5% deviation. And at the local level, there can be up to a 10% deviation in the size of local districts, which gives local, like city council districts, a little bit more leeway in how they draw the districts in their area. The other very important piece of legislation is the Voting Rights Act. And this really has 2 important sections. One was Section 5, and that requires a federal review of districts drawn there has been a history of discrimination. Unfortunately, and the Supreme Court struck that down in 2013. And so this will be the first time districts have been drawn in the last 50 years that there's not been federal review, especially in Texas. We're going to be talking about that and its impact at another slide. So unfortunately, how the districts are drawn by our legislatures will not be subject to any type of review at the federal level. Section 2, however, still is in force, and it prohibits procedures that deny persons the right to vote on account of race or color. So this would prevent things like voter dilution through packing and cracking and gerrymandering, but it is a private right of action. That means that an individual or a group would have to bring a case against the government for the way its districts have been drawn. And that's why a big push from the league is to document communities of interest and other things that can be used should we find that districts have been unfairly drawn at the state level or local level. So let's talk about a word we hear a lot in the redistricting process is gerrymandering. And what does that really mean? That means it's the practice of drawing a district to favor one group over another. And this can be either partisan, so that it favors Republicans or Democrats, or it can be racial, where it tries to actually discriminate against certain races by either what we call packing or cracking. And just to give you a little bit of explanation of what those terms mean, if you have a Black population that is put into one district, when they really could maybe carry the majority of 2 districts, that is called packing because they're basically limiting Black representation to 1 district versus 2. Another way is called cracking, and that is where you actually take a Black population and instead of giving them a district or 2, you split them up into multiple districts so they cannot ever carry the majority of any specific district, and that's called cracking. Those are both found to be illegal under the Voting Rights Act, Section 2. Now, what we would hope to see is that your elected officials actually reflect the population of your districts. And as you can see, after the redistricting in Texas in 2010, 2011, that did not hold true for our state. If you look in 2011, Texas had 58% of its population were people of color. However, only 36% of the legislatures were people of color, which indicates that there probably is not fair representation and the districts were not probably drawn appropriately. So why should we care? Why do we care if districts are drawn fair or not? Well, first of all, who's drawing the districts is the legislatures or the city council or the people that are currently in power. And there is no legal action that can be held them accountable. So if they draw districts that are safe for themselves, basically it means that it's not going to be a competitive district and it's going to be the elections really the primary. There's no compromise between parties on difficult issues, and this leads to very much polarization. And I think we're seeing a lot of that in our current democratic process. Another thing happens if a legislature draws the districts to benefit themselves, that means the incumbent will just be reelected. And why would anyone want to run a campaign against them? Well, they wouldn't put up the time or money. So they go unchallenged and there's no other choice on the ballot box. And that leads to incredibly low turnout when there's really no choice for citizens to make. So what is the league's position on redistricting? There are 2 main points. One is that we support an independent Citizens Redistricting Commission or committee as a preferred redistricting body. Why is that? Well, because legislatures are incentivized to draw districts that would benefit themselves. It really should be a process which gives fair and appropriate representation to all citizens, and we feel that could be done through an independent body. Second, the League supports redistricting processes and standards that promote fair and effective representations with maximum opportunity for public scrutiny. And we're going to talk a little bit more about what that means and processes in a little bit. So I said we're going to talk about the impact of not having Section 5 and federal review, and I think it's really going to be important for our state. So unfortunately, Texas has been found to have intentionally discriminated against voters of color under the Voting Rights Act Section 5 every decade for the past 50 years. This last decade of redistricting was very contentious, and found federal court actually found that Texas legislature had intentionally racially discriminated and committed constitutional violations. Texas was the only state in the nation not to gain preclearance under federal review. So as a result of this, for this legislative session on the state level, the League of Women Voters had been promoting a bill that would call for a fair and open process for review by all citizens. That process was not adopted, and the state basically adopted the exact same identical process it used in the previous census and redistricting process, which led to the federal court finding it had been discriminatory. So unfortunately, I think we can see where we're headed at a state level. And I can tell you that they are really gearing up to create documentation in case we have to bring a Section 2 under the law. So what are some processes that the League of Women Voters would like to see? And these are things that we're going to be talking about in our next conversations with City Council and Tyler as well. First, we'd really like to have public input hearings after the census data is released in September, so people can really analyze the data and create and tell their concerns to their specific legislatures or the City Council. Secondly, we really think there should be allowed virtual hearings and not maybe just one time when people can't make it. This is for not only for COVID, but allows more participation by more citizenry that may not be able to get off work or attend specific City Council meetings. And obviously, when maps are created, we'd like at least 14 days to review those maps, to digest them and provide input. This is going to be really important when we start thinking about the condensed timeframes that we know we're going to be facing in this next process. Also, if there are amendments to maps, we feel that those amendments should have 5 days to review. I can tell you in the past process at a state level, there were 11th hour changes kind of really in the dark of the night that were then approved the next day that no one, including other legislatures, had seen before. So this is a big problem. We also feel that the legislatures, when they provide the new district maps, they should provide an analysis of how these new maps and districts impact historically disenfranchised communities. And lastly, again, in the concern that there might be a Section 2 litigation, we think that all documents that identify how districts were drawn, what items were considered, should be kept and not destroyed. So those can be considered as they move forward in any potential litigation. So there's some current events that I think you're probably mostly aware of that I'd like to just brief you on. For those of you that don't know, there is a pending Supreme Court case. It's actually already been heard by the Supreme Court, but they are not ruled on it, at least as of 5 o'clock today when I last checked. It should come out any day. And while it doesn't seem super interesting to us, it's basically 2 voter right laws out of Arizona that were passed in 2016 that have finally were argued before the Supreme Court. The 2 voter rights laws basically are making it more difficult for voters and citizens to vote. And we're seeing those types of laws all over the country, especially in conservative states. These 2 specific laws disqualified votes that were placed in the wrong precinct by a citizen or voter, and also disqualified any vote that was done through a ballot collection. So if a citizen didn't, or voter didn't bring their vote and put it in themselves, it was just collected by a group, then that was found to not count. So a case was brought saying this was a violation, and the court heard the arguments. One interesting question that keeps coming up is sometimes the courts will allow rules that favor a partisan a party. So if it just favors Republicans over Democrats, that's found not to be discriminatory or illegal. However, it is not acceptable if it's racially discriminatory. And I think one of the things we're really grappling with in these cases is, can you delineate party from race, especially if one specific race votes more with one party? How can you delineate the two? But they have. And so if you actually heard the arguments when they said, well, aren't these, why would we allow this? And weren't these done with a discriminatory intent? The arguer for the law said, well, this is to help Republicans, and there's nothing wrong with that. So I think that's a very interesting delineation we should watch closely as these laws develop. Again, there has been no ruling yet by the Supreme Court, but unfortunately, the thought of the commentator I read was that these laws would probably be upheld, and how they rule and how they find racial versus party interests, partisan interests plays out will obviously impact voter laws going forward as we get to these next rounds of litigation that I expect to be coming based on several of the state laws that have been passed recently. So there's two interesting congressional actions that have been a result of some of these state laws against voter rights. And this is the For the People Act. There's a House and a Senate bill. And there's also the John Lewis Act. Again, unfortunately, the last I heard is that Mitch McConnell has said that he will filibuster the For the People Act. The John Lewis Act is still pending, but is unfortunately expected to have a similar result. So as long as a 60 vote the Senate is required, it is unlikely that any of these broader federal protections for voter rights will take place. So where does that leave us? Well, I think it's even more important, the legal work, and that people come and participate in their own local districts, because I feel like that's where we can have the most impact. And I feel like our voice is desperately needed, because without it, we know exactly how this is going to play out. So just to let you know, the League of Women Voters had, and with the help of many people on this call, who I greatly appreciate, had made a request to the City Council today at the meeting that they impanel an independent citizens redistricting committee to help be a part of the process of the redistricting in Tyler. And I think as people that attended obviously heard, it's going to be a very, very compact and streamlined process because of the delay of the census data to COVID. So basically for the city level, there are only 90 days in which to redraw districts. And for the county, it's even less. It's 45 days. And this is based on the timeline that people have to submit for primary runs in their specific districts. So the districts have to be already drawn in order for people to submit for each district for primary races. So this is going to be a very, very fast process. And I think it's all the more important that we be involved early to have make sure that it's a fair and open process and voices are heard. The city is working with a legal consultant, David Menendez, from a law firm out of San Antonio or Fort Worth. And his job is to help draw the districts. I will tell you, he's got a software and some mathematical models he can use, but he very clearly said at the council meeting today that he did not have the background of our city. So he had no idea where communities of interest are, where certain neighborhoods should not be split. And those are things that I feel like a citizens committee can bring to the table and help the city council make sure are taken into account as they redistrict the city. So public review and input is definitely needed. And I hope that you can help. So how can you help? Well, first of all, thank you for participating tonight. But I hope you will get involved or stay involved. And if you have not come or been a part of redistricting yet, it is getting ready to heat up. And of course, it's going to be at the time of year no one is busy. It's going to be, November and December and things, during the holidays and for school. But I'm telling you, this happens once every 10 years. And it's so incredibly important that people come to the table with a voice. So how can you help? First, we really need to identify communities of interest. That is a contiguous population with common social and economic interest that shouldn't be split into different districts. So we're thinking about potentially creating a Hispanic district. We need to make sure that we identify where Hispanic communities are and make sure that those are all contained in a single district when we redraw the districts in the city. Another important thing is that through the state level and its affiliation with the Southern Coalition for Justice, they are actually providing mapping fellows. I have applied for Tyler to have a mapping fellow. My understanding is they will be assigned by the end of the summer, which is in plenty of time for the release of the census data in the end of September. And they can actually take the census data from our city and help redraw and provide additional maps that perhaps David Menendez wouldn't provide to city council. So I think that's going to be a really interesting way and some alternate districts to be drawn that really should be considered. And that's why it's all the more important that we have an independent citizens committee that can help review those and provide input to the council. So obviously there's going to be lots of local, we're hoping there's going to be public hearings or we can be part of the actual committee that I'm hoping they're going to impanel. And obviously contact your city council and the mayor, Warren, to tell them that you support having a fair and open process and an independent committee to help on this redistricting process. So I think that's my 20 minutes. I know I covered a lot of material. A lot of you, I think, have heard a lot of this before, but please, I open it for questions or comments and I'll do my best to answer them.